After a 12-day voyage across the Atlantic, they finally stepped foot on U.S. soil, arriving at Pier 8 on Staten Island. The ship's manifest lists the hundreds of passengers that arrived that day. Name of passenger: Schneerson, Mendel. Occupation: Rabbi. Race: Hebrew. Place of birth: Soviet Union, Nikolaev. Passage paid for by parents-in-law. Destination address: Joseph Schneerson, 770 Eastern Parkway, New York. Marks of identification: wears a beard.
All right, so we were talking about that today is the 4th of July, happens to be the anniversary of the day the Rebbe came to America, and it's also Parshas Korach. So how do you combine, and Gimel Tammuz, the Rebbe's yard site, his day of passing, 30 years now, and you said that somehow you could combine and correlate all four of them. So how do we do that?
Indeed. What does the 4th of July, America's Independence Day, have to do with the day, indeed, as it falls this year, when the Rebbe and his Rebbetzin landed on the shores of America? And what does that have to do with this week's Torah portion? And what does that have to do with the 30-year anniversary of the Rebbe's passing? Well, let's consider. 4th of July is American Independence Day. Independence. That's the day that America became independent, and it was a country that was fostering peace and love and amity. And somewhere along the way, particularly in the last few years, we've lost our way. America has become so disjointed. There's so much animosity. There's so much strife. There's so much chaos on the streets. And I don't mean uniquely anti-Semitism, although that is very much a big part of it, but just generally the cancel culture that is the scourge of modern day American society. It's an epidemic. How did we go from what we were to become what we have now become? When the Rebbe, or the Rebbe's father-in-law, his predecessor, came to the shores of America, he said, and I'll quote his words in Yiddish, Mach da Eretz Yisrael, make this Israel. By definition, obviously the ideal maybe would have been to go to Israel, but now that he was in America and we are where we are, let's turn this place into a meaningful place, into an uplifting place, into a holy place. Let's make America a better place. That was his endeavor. And when his son-in-law, when the Rebbe succeeded him, he spent all of his many years of leadership striving to do exactly that by spreading spirituality throughout. The Rebbe's commitment wasn't just uniquely to his own flock, wasn't just uniquely to Jewish people, but was very much to society as a whole, always endeavoring to elevate the environment and make it the better place that it was always intended to be. The Rebbe commonly referred to America, again using the Hebrew, as a Medina Shel Chesed, meaning a country of compassion. That's what America was. It was always described as such. It was, and it is, a country of compassion. It gave Jews refuge throughout the course of history, just as it gives many others refuge as well. But again, somewhere along the way, to put it bluntly, we've lost the plot. That compassion, that kindness, it's gone. It's been replaced by cancel culture. So what does that have to do with our Torah portion? Well, the narrative is dramatic, it's tragic, it's unmistakably Jewish. There are two particular individuals in this week's Torah portion, known as Dasan and Aviram, who join Korach, whose name is the very name of the portion, to lead a mass mutiny against Moses, the leader of the Jewish people, and his brother Aaron, the high priest. What else is new, right? They gather together against Moses and Aaron, and they say to them, it's too much for you. We're all holy. God dwells amongst all of us. Why do you get to be leader? Cancel culture. Sounds familiar? Moses responds in brief and moving words. He attempts to persuade Korach, who happens to be his first cousin, that Aaron was appointed to his position by the instruction of God, that he himself was appointed to his position by the instruction of God. Nepotism isn't a factor. And in fact, the Talmud asks the question, Korach was a wise man. Korach was a righteous man, and he was a wealthy man. He lacked for nothing. What led him to such stupidity? And the Talmud answers very cryptically and briefly, saying his eye became blinded, meaning he became blinded by reality, because that is the power of the ego. We become sometimes so consumed with our own agenda that we can become utterly oblivious to the blatant facts that stare us in our face. And that's something in the midst of all of this is quite compelling. Moses goes and he summons this Dasan and Abiram. He wants to talk to them. He wants to try and have a conversation. They say, we won't come. It's not enough you took us out from Egypt. You want to kill us here in the desert. Who gives you the right to appoint yourself above us? Even if you gouge our eyes out, we're not going to come. Bold, vicious words. They're not going to surrender. They're determined to overthrow Moses and Aaron. God intervenes, as we read many times in the Bible. He wants to wipe out the rebels who are attempting to invalidate Moses as the leader of the Jewish people. God says to Moses, withdraw from the pavilion of Korach, Dasan, and Abiram. There's a tragic fate that awaits them, where the ground was going to swallow them up. But before Moses moves to execute God's instructions, the Bible inserts one seemingly incongruous verse. It says, Moses stood up and went over to Dasan and Abiram. That's it. First of all, why? God just said, remove yourself from them. And then it says he got up and he went to them. Second of all, he went up and went to them to do what? The Bible leaves the answer to our imagination. It doesn't tell us, but the message is clear. He's attempting one last time to persuade them to terminate their crusade. He's making one last attempt to save them, but alas, to no avail. And here's the curious bit. The Talmud comments on this verse and says, from here we learn, don't ever keep up a quarrel. Why? Why do we have to learn not to keep up a quarrel? From this one little cryptic verse, Moses got up and went towards Dasan and Abiram. We already have verses in the Bible that tell us don't harbor hate in your heart. Love your fellow as yourself. I mean, that's a straight enough commandment to teach us that we shouldn't maintain a quarrel. We shouldn't perpetuate dispute. We should always attempt to eradicate animosity. Why do the Talmudic rabbis feel compelled to derive the injunction of don't maintain a quarrel from this particular verse? Moses stood up and went to Dasan and Abiram. To understand that, we need to know the nature of these two people. And as I describe it, consider the environment and the culture in America today and ask yourself if you can't identify such people in the world today. Incident number 1, the beginning of the Exodus, still before they leave Egypt, taking us 70 years back to Moses' youth, where we are told that Moses observes one man raising his hand towards another, and he says, "Wicked one, why are you striking your brother?" And he turns to him and he says to him, "Oh, are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian the day before?" As we know, Moses killed an Egyptian that was beating up on a Jew. And Moses became very afraid. And they ratted him out to Pharaoh and he had to go on the run. Who were these two individuals, one raising the hand to the other, that ratted Moses out? Our rabbis tell us it was Dasan and Abiram. Incident number 2, after the Exodus. The heavenly manna falls from heaven. God gives an instruction, don't leave over the manna to the next day. In other words, show your faith. I promise you that this will fall daily, fresh for you, each morning. The idea of leaving over manna to the next day suggests a lack of faith, suggests that God may not deliver. I've got to store up. God gave the instruction not to do so. 2 people did. 2 men did. Moses becomes angry. God becomes angry. The manna that they left over became immediately wormy and became putrid. Who were these men that betrayed Moses' instruction? Dasan and Abiram. Incident number 3, the story of the spies. They come back from checking out the land of Israel. They dissuade their brethren from the motivation, willingness to go into the land of Israel. And the people go into a tailspin and they cry and they lament their fate. And ultimately they're doomed to wander for 40 years in the desert. In the midst of all of that, one man said to his brother, "You know what, let's appoint a new leader and let's go back to Egypt." Here again, who was this one man who said this to his brother? It was a conversation between Dasan and Abiram. And then finally, the 4th incident is as per the story of Korach that I mentioned before, leading the mutiny against Moses, using language of even if you gouge our eyes out, suggesting Moses is some kind of sadistic killer. These 4 incidents paint a very accurate picture of who these 2 guys were. Not idealistic adversaries disputing Moses for ideological reasons. They quarreled between themselves as well. They're not driven by envy. They're not looking for power and prestige possessed by Moses. They challenged him even in Egypt before he became leader. They were rabble rousers, just people who would not miss an opportunity to fight, to argue, even if they stood to gain nothing. Forever determined to undermine Moses and his authority. They even, again, had the audacity to suggest that he's some kind of sadist, that he would poke their eyes out as though he was some kind of madman. They despised Moses because he was their opposite. He stood for everything that they loathed. Isn't it amazing? After all these incidents, after an animosity that lasted for 70 years, even after God instructed Moses to ensure everybody should remove themselves from their midst, says the verse, Moses stood up and went over to Dathan and Abiram. You can imagine the reaction of Jews around there. Moses, it's beneath your dignity. For 7 decades, they've loathed you. Don't look to discuss peace. For the sake of your dignity and God's dignity, it's beneath you to approach them. Don't be kinder and wiser than God. But here we see exactly that which made Moses the great leader that he was, why he was worthy to become the leader. His dedication, his loyalty, his love for every single member of his people knew no bounds. Even as his fiercest and lifelong enemies were engaged in an intense battle against him, he's not going to give up on the chance to make peace with them and save them. This verse, Moses stood up and went over to Dathan and Abiram, demonstrates to us why the mutiny against Moses was so profoundly wrong. It was his uncompromising connection with his people, no matter the depths to which they have fallen, that made him qualified to have the power that he had. And here's the point. Only a human being who is selfless, only a human being who has some real humility, only such a human being can be trusted with power, or indeed with so much power. Moses' extraordinary compassion or dedication for his people turned him into an authentic Jewish leader. Thus, says the Talmud, from here we learn that one should never keep up a quarrel. The instruction, don't hate your brother in your heart, love your brother as yourself, these are ideals that we all look to aspire to. Absolutely so. But what about when it's quite clear to you that that person has so much issue with you and that they're addicted to alienating themselves from you? What about when you can justifiably assume that no matter what you'll do, this person is never going to change? Write them off. Accept the quarrel as a fact of life. Make peace with the state of war. But Moses says no. He stood up and he went over to Dathan and Abiram. Never keep up a quarrel. He could have rightly assumed that these adversaries would not change their position. But he didn't allow any assumptions based on past experiences to stop him from peace efforts. He knew that fighting in animosity is a malignant disease, and he's not going to give up on people. Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi, the author of the Tanya, tells us how we all contain some element of Moses' characteristic. It means that we too are empowered to emulate that example, at least in some small fashion. We should inculcate our mindsets to become uncomfortable with disunity, to feel revolted by fragmentation. We should never cease to confront our arrogance and strive for peace, even with people we can easily write off. And that brings us to the Rebbe. Besides the fact that the Rebbe always made it his business, from day one, from the day that he assumed his mantle of leadership, in his inaugural Farbrengen, his gathering, his speech, he spoke about the importance of there being love. He emphasized the key point about how, although we may be two Jews with three opinions, we must always endeavor to have one heart. But more than that was that the Rebbe uniquely dealt with those who were opposed to him, because some individuals in the Jewish world never missed an opportunity to criticize him, to denigrate him, to scoff at him. Some even made it a mission to sow hatred amongst him and his movement amongst their own students. Motivated by ideology, by ignorance, by envy, by arrogance, these people made his life difficult. Yet the Rebbe never ceased to love them and to terminate the animosity and separation as best as he could. He never made peace with the fact that some people simply won't get along with one another. He loathed the disunity, as should we. And he sought every opportunity to foster mutual respect and affection, as should we. In fact, if you think about it, if the Rebbe's opponents would only know how much he cared for their well-being, it probably would never harbor negative sentiments to him in the first instance. One rabbi once verbally attacked the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and when the rabbi realized that he was mistaken, he apologized. He wrote a note to the Rebbe to apologize and express his hope that the Rebbe will not bear a grudge against him. And the Rebbe's response, which is something that we should all take on board, is, believe me when I tell you, I don't have the time to bear grudges against people. Imagine the amount of time that we expend bearing grudges against people, harboring animosity against people, allowing them to live rent-free in our own headspace. The Rebbe attempted to inculcate this perspective in the hearts of all of us. Where do we find the time to bear grudges? Where do we obtain the energy to hate? Use the time for better things, foster peace, regardless of differences, and look to change the world for the better. Here's the bottom line. There's a lot of disagreement out there in the world today, and that's okay, but there's a huge difference between disagreement and disrespect. Our problem is not a disagreement problem. Our problem is not even a diversity problem. Our problem is a disrespect problem. If I disagree with you, we'll talk it out. We'll sit there and we'll say, okay, let me hear your perspective, you hear my perspective. And by the way, we may never come to any agreement on the matter, but at least we'll tease out some common understanding, and that's okay. So when I disagree with you and you disagree with me, we talk it out. But if I disrespect you, we will not talk. We'll just shut each other down or look to cancel one another. The hard fact is, we might indeed disagree often. And that's okay. But if we disrespect one another, that puts up walls between us. That's not okay. And today, if you say something wrong, if you tweet something wrong, or you tweet something that people disagree with, you express an opinion that is surprising or contradicts the established view people have of you, and that demands for you to be fired, defriended, or otherwise driven from the realms of men, quickly follow. Cancel culture, the scourge of the malaise of our 21st century, is scorched earth partisan politics where people we disagree with are maligned. Korach demonstrates. It divides families. It divides society. It tears apart relationships. Dasan and Abiram demonstrate. It polarizes and it pits people against one another. Again, I can't say it enough. It's my favorite catchphrase, which I coined and will be my epitaph. We may always be two Jews, as indeed we are, with three opinions, but we should always maintain one heart. And a lot of people today have what is known as confirmation bias. In other words, we seek out to listen to only people that we agree with. What we really need is a collaboration bias. Seek out people that we may in fact be different from, and look for people that might have a different perspective to us. Engage with them. Hear another side. There's a lot of disagreement out there, and that's normal. Unfortunately, there's too much disrespect out there as well. We need to find another way. And as the Rebbe emphasized to us time and time and time again, we can and we need to do better. When the Baal Shem Tov saw in his time misfortune threatening the Jewish people, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. He would light a fire, some mystical ideal, he would say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune would be averted. His chief disciple, known as the Maggid of Mezrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, and he would go to the same place in the forest and he would say, Master of the universe, I don't know how to light the fire, but I can still say the prayer. And again, the miracle will be accomplished. Still later, his successor, Rabbi Moshe Leibov Sassev, as he was known, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and he would say, I don't even know how to light the fire. I don't know the prayer, but at least I know the place to come to, and that should be enough. And the miracle was accomplished. And then it fell to his disciple, Rabbi Israel of Ruzhin, to overcome misfortune. And he would sit in his own armchair in his own home with his head in his hands. And he would say to God, I'm unable to light the fire. I don't know the prayer. I can't even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story. And this must be sufficient. And it was. And here's the point. There are so many different people that have different ways by which they engage with their Judaism, by which they identify, by which, if you will, they approach God. Some can light the fire. Their souls are aflame. They're full of passion and fervor for their faith and their people. Yet others may not be as deeply connected. They don't feel the full fervor. But they pray. They still remain eminently connected. They may not be dancing on spiritual rooftops, but their faith and their traditions are still everything to them. Their people mean everything to them. And then there are those whom the fire is not discernible, and even prayer is an alien concept. Maybe they endured, suffering, pain in some manifestation that led them to become skeptical or embittered. But they still know where to go. Every now and then they'll surface, however sporadically. Maybe for a sad occasion, God forbid, or for a joyous occasion, to synagogue. And finally, there are those for whom the fire seems all but extinguished. Prayer is something other people do. They don't even know where to go. All they have is a story to tell. A story about a parent or a grandparent whom they recall being Jewish. A grandmother who lit her Shabbat candles. A mother who fried latkes. They remember their grandfather wearing tefillin or saying Kaddish. They can tell the story, but that's all. It's a story of times gone. That's the reality of the history of our people through the ages. We have transformed through the course of time from the fire of once upon a time to the storytellers that epitomize so many today. You'd think it's a lost cause. You'd think we ought to give up. You'd think that we're spectators observing a, Shakespearean tragedy play out. But there was one man who rose to the challenge, a giant of a leader, committed himself to recognizing that even those who could but only tell the story still have little embers burning within, and that so long as there is a spark, and there is always a spark, there's potential for even that person, for every person, to aspire to light the fire once more. And when the Rebbe committed himself to his mission, like many greats before him, the miracle was once again accomplished. When the Brandenburg Gate, upon which Nazi flags were hanging, now has a public menorah erected in front of it. Isn't that a miracle? When Uganda, home of Idi Amin, who famously held 106 Israeli hostages, now has a Chabad house, is that not a miracle? When the former Soviet Union persecuted millions of Jews and today boasts more schools and other such like religious institutions than all of Europe combined, is that not a miracle? Because the point is, to the Rebbe, those who light the fires and those who say the prayers and those who know where to go and those who tell the story, they're all part of the same people, the same family, the same history, and the same destiny. And more than that, the Rebbe also believed in the intrinsic value of every single human being, because we were all formed in the image of our Creator. And therefore, the Rebbe always identified infinite potential within every single one of us. As he famously declared to a young man who shared with him some very personal struggle, the Rebbe said, I envy you. That God has given you this struggle means he also gave you the unique strengths with which to overcome it. I don't have such a challenge, which means I don't have that unique strength either. And you need to ask yourself, where would the world be today without the Rebbe's vision? Who would provide a Passover Seder for 2,500 Israeli backpackers in Kathmandu? Where would Jewish women have access to a ritual bath in Saigon? How would Israeli war orphans celebrate their bar mitzvah every year in Israel? What would have become of the near 3,000 children victimized by the Chernobyl nuclear disaster? All of that is a miracle. And here's the greatest miracle of all. I have almost every newspaper clipping from 30 years ago, following the Rebbe's passing. Such was the impact of the Rebbe that literally every respectable broadsheet throughout the world carried the news. New York Times, London Times, LA Times, you name it. They all share two common themes. They reported on the Rebbe's sad passing from this world, whilst referencing his vast accomplishments, and they questioned the viability of Chabad going forward. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, is that since that fateful day, on the 3rd of Tammuz, 1994, in the past 3 decades, more than 2,000, and more closer to 3,000, more rabbis and their wives went out. Hundreds more schools and Chabad houses were opened. And why? Because when you limit yourself to your own domain and to your own little slice of your universe, then your impact is always going to be limited. But when you commit yourself to the totality of the world around you, those who know the fire, those who know how to pray, those who only know how to go to a place, and those who could only but tell the story, when your concern and your love is to every single one, then the leadership continues no less, the demands continue no less, and the impact continues no less. Make no mistake about it. Demographers were predicting the demise of Chabad after the passing of the Rebbe, but it has gone from strength to strength because the legacy of true leaders is eternal as their life continues to aspire everlastingly. A leader, any leader, is great not because of their power, but because of their ability to empower others. Great leaders are like the best conductors. They reach beyond the notes to touch the magic in the players. They don't enforce, they inspire. That endures, that impact's ongoing. That indeed was the Rebbe.